All right, we are live and recording. Awesome, guys. A lot of excitement for today, including for myself. Learning is always going to happen in layers, so I don't like to overhype any particular webinar. You know, what kind of causes a particular sense of wow, or breakthrough, or just whatever is going to vary from person to person. But what I'm going to be talking about in this webinar is going to be really a great concepts. And as you absorb it, use it, as it kind of breaks through for you, then the potential for it to help you is tremendous. And then, and also to help you understand law of implication as a whole, right? So, with the title of this webinar, I had things like mind and like putting the pieces together, and that's all true, but and goals and success and so forth. But as I was working on this webinar, then it organized for me how, like in my mind, how we have another great kind of organizing principle. Last webinar, we talked about norms and standards, right? And we will want to continue to see how big of a deal those can play with the way our mind works and our thinking, and also how we want to be able to think outside of those at times. Or not at times, but it's not like we reject norms and standards, but what we do is we don't let norms and standards be the outer Othello frame, right? We want to be able to create an understanding of life and think things through and come to conclusions accurately. And when we're doing that, then what's normal or what our existing standards are and so forth won't need to not rule the day, right? Because of course those are assembled by our mind through an approximate associative process of looking around and just seeing how things should be by how our peers seem to be doing, how much money they seem to be making, how morally good they seem to be at various things, whatever. And our mind creates various standards for ourselves that what happens there is when you're going about a project, you're trying to succeed at something, basically you're living up to your own standards, right? Including things like being like classy, if that's the type of thing that you have as a standard, right? A certain amount of status or class, acting a certain way, whether or not you dress a certain way, get even tattoos, whatever. Those are things like, if you bring home a girl or a guy and you have a sense that your parents will feel like they're high enough kind of status or classy enough versus not, right? That sort of feeling. I'm just identifying what I'm talking about when I say that. So, or if you're doing a project, if you're going to bed at night and these are all the same types of things with types of standards. If you're going to bed at night and your mind is thinking whether you did a good enough job that day, whether you accomplished enough. If you're working out and did you put enough work in? Did you put enough effort into any particular endeavor or goal or project this day or overall, where you feel like you should have learned it by now, right? Or you should have accomplished it, or you should get a certain amount of reward. All of those are standards that your mind fabricates, right? It doesn't create it out of thin air, but it still fabricates it. You can kind of learn to understand, right? We've talked about this, where that comes from, right? Basically things like peers and what appears normal, and a whole bunch of inputs, right? But the real choice is going to come between accuracy, like bottleneck thinking. So there's a fascinating choice once you see it between this intuitive sense of living up to standards and measuring up to standards that your mind fabricates for yourself, like how quickly you should learn something, right? Like versus accuracy, and accuracy might be what's the bottleneck. So like, why don't people think strategically? When I talk about we should think in terms of bottlenecks, then when I explain it in a certain way, it might make a lot of sense. And And so there must be something diverting people from just thinking, well, what's the kind of most impactful bottleneck right now with this particular project or whatever, or with a relationship, or with getting someone to like you that you want to like you, and so forth. Instead of that, then people will be thinking without thinking, right? But kind of automatically be trying to live up to standards, right? So if people are doing a project, we all know it's very important, or whatever, you're living your life, you're in a relationship, and you have an idea, it's very important to massage the other person's ego, right? Like to not imply to them that they're violating either your standards or their standards, that they're not good enough, they're not awesome enough, right? I'm always putting this in different ways, but when I talk about whether you're awesome enough, right? Trying to prove that you're awesome. That's the default. That's what's going to be going on. And that's what blocks people from thinking in terms of bottlenecks. It really doesn't occur to people in many cases to think about what's the most impact, right? Or just what's going to accurately make a project succeed. Instead, it becomes more important, or a relationship be happy. It becomes more important to kind of believe that we're awesome and worry about being criticized or criticizing others. Okay. So we talked about that last time. Don't want to get too much repeating that. And now we're going to look at something along similar lines, but a different organizing principle. And it, I call everything that I'm talking about law of implication. So our mind fabricates norms and standards, but then it also, a huge thing that it does is fabricate causes and implication. And I wrote made a little diagram or whatever you call it here. I wrote a cause and then an arrow and then X and then implication. And then if I go to the next slide, just to keep it. So if we feel bored, all right, then what our mind is going to do is fabricate. It doesn't mean that it's wrong, but it's still fabricate. It's going to come up with a cause of why we're bored. And then it's going to come up with implications such as that we're going to continue to be bored for at least the next several minutes. We're going to continue to be bored until and unless we are able to leave the situation, or this, that, or the other thing, right? If I wrote somebody likes me here as the X, so if someone likes us, then our mind comes up with a cause of why that might be. If we want someone to like us, like if we're trying to think about that we want it to happen rather than that it already happened, then our mind is going to also go to like, well, what are the causes of why somebody likes us? And without thinking about it, people are going to, once again, what is our mind going to do for a cause for that? Well, if I'm awesome, right? And I use that, of course, as a kind of lighthearted shorthand, but I think we can recognize that in all kinds of ways, right? If we're going about dating or trying to get a job with doing interviews and stuff, then what do we think when we walk into the job interview? Kind of by default, without thinking about it, well, if they judge me to be awesome enough, then they'll like me, right? And so that, or when it comes to with the whole dating world, right, the world of dating, then people have this intuitive sense that our mind fabricates that whether or not people like you or the opposite opposite gender wants to date you, or whichever gender you're going for wants to date you, then intuitively, right, people think, if you look at how they talk and act and so forth, it's clear that the cause of people liking us in people's minds, it's fabricated, is basically our own awesomeness, right? So that's fabricated. The actual cause is a lot closer to people like us when, like, again, the more context we have about how the mind really works, right? And I have one way of looking at the mind where it's kind of like a goal-achieving mechanism, right? And how I also talk about how the mind takes the idea of good and it kind of twists it into its own version, which has to do with what? That which furthers our goals, or the goals that are in a particular person's mind. Anything that's associated, whether it's an object or an event or a person or the qualities of people, anything that's associated with furthering the goals in a person's mind, right? And people can have a lot of goals, and different goals can also be more active or triggered or primed at a particular time, right? Certain goals can be more at the forefront of someone's mind. But people have a bunch of goals, right, in their mind. But anything that a person's mind associates with furthering their goals will be what what feels like good to them, right? That's what the mind kind of twists or reinterprets as good, is that which is associated, right, with by that same mind as furthering goals. So so mostly it's going to come down to that when there's an initial sense of somebody liking you, is whether you're kind of triggering off certain things that a person associates with good, which is going to align with things that further their goals. And it doesn't have to be overt, like that you're like a movie producer and they want to be in a movie. Well, that might help, right? But there's all sorts of things that can, of course, make people kind of feel like you're the kind of person who being around them would further various goals, right? And people are complicated; they have different goals, and one of their main goals, of course, is to feel awesome about themselves, right? So therefore, we're often going to like people of a similar culture, right? And so people might react especially strongly to someone who's like feels like they're a similar culture but a different on the surface race, right? Because now they can feel good about themselves for being kind of multicultural and diverse in their friends. But what people don't really want is diversity with like culture, right? Because culture is a whole framework of what you should or shouldn't do, and who's high status and who isn't, and right, and just a whole bunch of standards, right? And so people of your similar culture will reflect back to you, if you're aligned with that culture as well, that yeah, those standards are the real ones that matter, and you're awesome because you're whatever standards we feel like matter, we really try to live up to those, whether it's dressing a certain way or going to certain schools or making a certain amount of money or putting in a certain amount of hours of work every day versus not, or doing a certain amount of exercise, whatever it might be, right? There's all sorts of potential different standards that people can feel like are important, and we can only have so much time in a day, right? And so we'd rather have reflected back to us that the things that we're investing in are those are the important things, right? If we dress a certain way or talk in a certain way, sound, quote Shakespeare, whatever, then if we had that reflected back to us that, yeah, wow, you're intelligent, you notice that quote from Shakespeare, you even realize, which of his books that is, right? And then someone who's into that will like that reflected back to them, that like, oh yeah, that's important, right? So that'll boost their sense of that they're awesome, right? And so forth. So it's not about being generally awesome, but if you look at how people talk and think and so forth, it's clear that when people are dating or applying for jobs or just trying to make friends in general, they tend to accidentally think in terms of a generalized sense of awesome rather than sort of a matching, right? A kind of cultural matching or whatever type of awesome. And it's really great to just realize that fairly simple difference where you're looking for a match rather than a generalized sense that you're awesome, or that feeling or sentiment that they didn't realize how great I was, like, so that's their loss, like in dating, right, or a job or whatever, right, like I wasn't good enough for them, so I'll show them, or or they were wrong, or they're silly because I wasn't good enough for them. But that betrays an assumption of a generalized sense of awesomeness, right, or whatever, instead of understanding the matching. And when I in practice in life, it was a huge benefit to me in terms of looking for this kind of specialized type of matching, where instead of trying to generally be awesome and be liked and be thought to be great and awesome and all that, I understood that when it came to friends, or when it came to finding a significant other, or generally like having girls think I was an attractive guy, it was just going to be this kind of specialized, there's kind of overall cultures, and then there's these subcultures that some of them don't even have names, right? But there's girls that like a certain type of intellectual vibe, there's girls that like all kinds of other things, right? And so there's kind of a subcategory or culture of girls that would respond a lot more strongly to me than others, right? And realizing it was a subculture thing rather than a generalized awesomeness in practice is just huge, right? If you think through the implications of how you think, act, all of a sudden you can have a different type of confidence. That's the confidence that's like, if we match, if we kind of have this subculture in common, that maybe 5% of people might be in any particular subculture, right? And that's kind of 5% just kind of totally pulled out of my butt or whatever. But thinking roughly along that type of percentage, that was kind of, it's there's something useful about that general number, right? When it comes to either friends or dating or even getting a job and doing interviews or whatever. And then thinking in terms of that will give you a certain type of confidence that, like, again, that sense that if we match, then, and having some kind of sense of where you might match, or the type of person or employer or whatever that might be impressed by you. Then it's a confidence based on something more accurate, rather than this any sort of generalized judging, generalized blaming, generalized awesomeness. It's very common, and it's really very an impactful idea in terms of your actual life. Like it comes into play constantly, right? Someone might feel like, oh, people don't care, people aren't friendly, right? I mean, you can have people go through their whole lives kind of lonely and miserable, all because they think that getting friends or significant others is a general thing about being generally awesome, versus finding that subculture that, again, might not have a name. It might not be something as obvious as like dressing goth, right? Or just like going to church and meeting someone there or whatever. The subculture or subtype of person that you kind of mesh with might not be something, again, like that's kind of already has a good label that's easy to spot, and you kind of have to figure it out. But if someone just doesn't by chance stumble across that, and then they think it's kind of general, then they start to generalize in a different way, like, oh, people think I'm invisible, right? Or they don't pay attention to us. Well, and if you think about that from the other end, well, we have to treat almost everybody. We can't take on everyone's problems. We can't be interested in everyone, right? People only have so much attention, and especially when we have a family, right, that takes up a ton of just fills us up in all sorts of ways with nonstop kind of little problems, and people want our attention, right? The minute you have a couple kids and a wife or husband, then that's like a lot of attention, right? And then if you want time to yourself and so forth, so you're not going to have like a ton of in a lot of, depending on your who you are, right? Of space to focus on friends or other people, and then then there's your work right on top of that. And so, given how little space people have and how many kind of potential acquaintances they might have, then they're not going to behave like they're just kind of fascinated with everybody and into all their problems, right? So if you have the wrong type of perspective, you can feel like nobody cares, right? But then if you, and similar with dating, right, and so forth, and then valuing when you do find a match, right? Because when someone wants to believe that they're generally awesome, then what happens when they do overlap with someone? Well, now that's evidence that they're generally awesome. Like, oh my goodness, right? This girl likes me. That means everyone likes me, and I don't have to value this particular match or overlap, because it just proved to me that I'm awesome, right? Because whatever's happening recently and psychologically near just seems to be, and then on top of that, if we want to believe it, right, then any evidence will do. And so that's just such a real and impactful thing in people's lives. Okay, I kind of delved into that in a bunch of detail, but it can show how getting cause wrong with why people like us, and then the implication. Well, if someone does like us or appears to like us, then they're going to keep liking us tomorrow. And yet another thing is if the cause of me believing that someone likes me is a bunch of attention from that person, and then if I don't have their attention for a certain amount of time, then it's pretty common that if people don't get attention from someone, they start to think that, oh, maybe the person doesn't like me anymore, when the person might totally like them just the same, right? But they start getting paranoid in their head and so forth. I even delve into that a little more in another slide, but just to continue on here, the cause of business succeeding, right? With that, people get that wrong, and then they also the implication, if they get the cause wrong, then they'll tend to think that it'll keep succeeding. And once again, you're going to see the same awesome explanation, right? The mind really likes to over-attribute cause to a person being particularly, once again, awesome or evil, right? Of course, it likes with emotions to ascribe them, to blame them on other people in a lot of cases. Or it might, again, blame it on the person, like kind of beating up themselves, where they're, again, generally speaking, not great enough or whatever. Like I find if you do business with people who are broke, then that circumstance will have a very large impact on things. And it will have a large impact on the effective integrity that they show. I say that to draw a contrast with normally the cause that people give to whether someone shows integrity is whether that person has integrity, has character, is an honest person. And again, when you come to learn that our mind will greatly, again, overascribe things like integrity to being inherent within a person and greatly value or underestimate the impact of the environment on how the person behaves. In this case, the person kind of being broke, right? People do this with politicians, right? You might have heard me rail against the seemingly sensible idea of people say, well, I vote for the person, not the party, right? They'll say like, well, I pay attention and I judge the individual person. At the party level, like in America, actually the context that goes along with what political party a person's with is actually way more impactful and way more of a predictor of how they're going to act and vote and how that's going to impact your own life, rather than how they seem to be as a person. It's a lot like a job interview or a sports agent. There's at this point, it's pretty much psychologically proven that using kind of simple algorithms for, if you're a sports agent, like just simple things to decide who you should draft or not, and how much you should, try to offer them as money, like basically, how much you kind of invest in a particular ball player that's up and coming, or with a job interview for an applicant, just going by a few simple measures is going to be more accurate than a job interview, right? And yet it feels so intuitive to people. As soon as a person has, I could read you some excerpts from the book, but I'm just gonna, there's one excerpt I'm gonna read to you in a moment, but about something, but I'm not gonna read a zillion excerpts, but I'm just summarizing some things here for you. And there's many books that, and sources that all corroborate this, where once a person's given a specified experience, like basically once you meet someone and talk to them, or you even hear an interview with them, like on video, then you're going to forget all about whether, like if you're asked, there could be any number of things where there's maybe, in general, from the default base rate, a 34% chance that someone might do something. Whether it's help a stranger, given that there's 12 other people that hear the stranger's call for help, right? In such an instance, then someone might have like a 1 out of 3 chance of helping the person. Rather than, as opposed to if they're alone with a person who needs help, they have like a pretty much 100% chance, unless they're kind of like a psychopath or something, right? Or whether or not a person is as a profession is a librarian or a salesperson, right? There's just like a heck of a lot more salespeople than librarians. So the base rate of whether, in a vacuum, if I say there's a guy named Paul, is he a salesperson or a librarian? Then you would have to bet that he was a salesperson, because there's just a lot more of them in the population, right? Or is he like a business major or a much rarer major, like some specialization in like an English literature type of a major? Then you'd bet on the one that just had a higher base rate. But the same thing if you were to have various statistics, or just some simple statistics about people, and then if you were deciding who to hire, then you would just go with the ones that hit the statistics that made more, that if you've done some research or had some experience in the past, had a higher chance of having being a successful employee or business partner or whatever. But then what's fascinating is the minute people have a personal experience with a person, the base rates that would otherwise be used, they get like 100% thrown out by the mind. All of a sudden, they just don't matter. So if you would say, yeah, Paul would be I have to bet that Paul would be a salesperson rather than a librarian. But then you see an interview with Paul, or you meet Paul, and he acts like a person like that would be similar to a librarian. Then all of a sudden, the base rate of salespeople versus librarians in the population gets almost completely thrown out by the brain, like really just about 100%, and in a lot of cases. And then it's just all about the your kind of personal judgment with that person. I read you the clip in last webinar where their personal judgment, they're designing the curriculum, right, for decision making and so forth in general. And they were about a year into creating it, and they all they kind of individually were asked how much longer it would take to complete the project, and the average is about 2 years, between 1.5 and 2.5 years. And yet because they were personally involved with the whole situation, right? And yet the base rate when they asked someone who really knew other groups that had worked on curriculums, the base rate was about 40% of them didn't complete the project at all. In other groups that were doing curriculums, so about a 60% completion rate, and then it would take about 7 to 10 years. So again, when people had a personal experience, they just throw out the rest. So when people are thinking about whether their business is going to succeed, then people do the same thing, right? And the cause of a business succeeding will be things like, in people's minds, it's fabricated, will be some combination of effort, right? Like again, if they work up to their own standard of how much effort you're supposed to put in, and then their own combined with their own awesomeness is pretty much what people think will make their business succeed. Maybe if there's kind of a little good sounding story about how it's all going to work. And then if a business does succeed, then the implication is it'll either continue to succeed or actually increase, because then people will say, well, I'll just set a bigger goal. Like I set a goal and it worked, I'll just set a goal for a larger growth of my business, or some amount of growth, which will make my numbers larger. And so that's what's going to happen, right? The new norm and standard is how well my business is doing right now, and then I want to grow from there. And people really believe that nonsense, right? I mean, I've seen it over and over again as people think that way, and they think that's how business works, and how causes, what causes things to succeed, and what it means when something does succeed. So let me read this excerpt here. On page 206 of Thinking Fast and Slow that I referenced before. I found this particularly cool. All right, the halo effect and outcome bias. So the halo effect, of course, is that when you have a good experience with someone, or they write a good essay as their first of 3 essays and you're a college professor grading them, or whatever, then however they trigger you to feel like they're extra good, then you'll judge subsequent stuff from that person, like their other 2 essays, if there's 3 essays on a college test and you're grading it, or whatever it might be, right? With people, if you've had a good experience, then the halo effect, of course, you're going to be extremely biased in your future judging of what another, the person after that. And then outcome bias is pretty cool. Let me see if I have, here we go. Let me just read you a quick thing about outcome bias. I'll read this. I know that it might be hard to follow perfectly when I'm reading something, but hopefully it'll be helpful. Hindsight is especially unkind to decision makers who act as agents for others: physicians, financial advisors, third base coaches, CEOs, social workers, diplomats, politicians. We are prone to blame decision makers for good decisions that worked out badly. So a good decision that worked out badly would mean it was a good, given the situation at the time, right? They made the right decision. Not that it worked out well, of course, because it worked out badly. And to give them too little credit for successful moves that appear obvious only after the fact. There is a clear outcome bias. Do you guys remember, there's a fascinating thing I've just been popping into my head lately. When 9/11 happened, 2001, I remember it, well, not the, I mean, the horror I remember to some degree, but I was kind of removed from it. It wasn't like I wasn't like in New York or anything. And my mind kind of goes to like what to do next. It's kind of strategic that way. I don't really anyway. So I remember that it might have been almost lost to history in a certain sense, but George Bush's initial reaction was something that I agreed with, which is really the best response for the most part to a terrorist attack like that is ignore it. And George Bush's first response, which was then mocked by the left, and it's just generally not something people want to see in politicians and quote unquote leaders and so forth, is he was like basically that was his initial idea was let's just live our lives well. And, basically he was mocked for saying like, go shopping and so forth, right? That would have saved trillions, right? So the terrorist attack cost 3,000 lives and billions of dollars, right, in damage. And then the subsequent response cost trillions. And I'm not sure how many lives, but however you want to measure it in like all kinds of different ways, right? There's also, it's easy to not think of them as human or actual lives. Like there was the in Afghanistan and the recent pullout, there was apparently I think it was 13 U.S. service members that got killed, which was incredibly tragic. But then there was like 200 Afghanis that were killed, and it was generally reported that 13 Americans were killed. Anyway, however many people have died. But doing nothing, it tends to be like a not a popular thing, right, for government people to do. Anyway, sorry, that's a little bit random, but just mentioning that. So, a little bit like with the FDA, right? Like if the FDA had simply not interfered, there were pills to pretty much cure COVID prior to COVID, and then in the very beginning of COVID, that were blocked politically and by the FDA, not by Trump. They were mostly blocked by the left politically. And then, of course, the FDA blocked vaccines for a year, right? Because vaccine itself was made right away, and then it was blocked. And so, because the problem is, right? They do nothing, and there's a problem, then they're blamed, right? So you kind of have this bias towards doing something, and then the cost is just astronomical, and yet it just makes perfect sense to people. I mean, Bush was really like that because that's when he got, of course, after he was received such pushback for his initial response. Then he got up with the bullhorn, right on the rubble, and was like, "We're going to track these people down. We're gonna get them, right, and we're not going to give up, and we're gonna take them out, right." And then there was great cheering, and so, but it's fascinating, right? Like there was incredibly unanimous and powerful praise and cheering for what was gonna. And I'm kind of neither complimenting nor criticizing Bush here. I'm looking at how I'm kind of ambivalent on Bush myself, right? There's plenty to like about him, and then there's plenty to criticize. But so that's neither here nor there, like in terms of that. But what's fascinating is that the decision, which was going to burn trillions and trillions of dollars, and then whatever the human cost, which I'm not dismissing, I just don't have good numbers on that, was cheered and the decision that was going to, right, like the cost was like the cost of like 1,000 terrorist attacks, right? Like if it was say $2.5 billion in damage from the 9/11, and then if the subsequent cost was like, geez, if it was like, I don't know how many trillion, 24 trillion, 2.10 trillion. I think you measure it in different ways, right? Depending. If it was 24 trillion, that's actually 10,000 times, right? The cost of 2.4, right, billion, because 2.4 trillion would be 1,000 times. 24 trillion is 10,000 times. So that's like 10,000 terrorist attacks on par with 9/11, except for the human cost, which again you can kind of argue in different ways. But one way or the other, we kind of like but when you see something like that, what we don't want to do is be like, oh, that's politics, or oh, that's that. But the mind operates on heuristics in day-to-day levels, and an individual level, and on a kind of a public policy, more like global social policy level. Social policy and what happens there really reflects and gives us kind of a magnifying glass on how the exact same thing that we're going to do as individuals and as small groups in business and in personal relationships and so forth, right? So wherever we look, it's like a hologram. We're gonna hone in on what's going on, and these kind of major errors that are going to repeat. They might look different on the surface, or look like they're in different spheres or realms or whatever. Or it might look like the kind of thing other people do and not we ourselves do. But there's not that many major errors, right? Like how many times do I repeat the error about being awesome, living up to our standards versus thinking about bottlenecks, right? Just in different ways. There's just a few major errors that are repeated in large and small scales throughout our lives, and our days, and little decisions, day-to-day decisions, large decisions. Our lives also can have massive inflection points where the one fork in the road can lead to just astronomically different outcomes. We might miss, one of the reasons I talk about luck is there might be one or two really lucky relationships that are going to come your way in your life. There might be, of course, depending on how you lump and split and judge, measure it, certainly you can have 10 or 20 or 100 various degrees of lucky relationships in your life, right? But there might be, again, just depending on how you want to think about it. But we can also think about it that like there could be 1 to 3 people that could just have a massive impact in your life, right? Like for me, like my wife, Mike Long, and then Greg Morrison, right, for example. And there's a ton of other people I could list in various degrees, but those 3 people just were these really lucky things that came across my path. But then it happened that in each case, I took it with very seriously. And so there's like day-to-day decisions that add up to a big impact, but then there's spotting and harnessing these like massive luck spikes as well. There's when it comes to taking advantage of the stock market, which I have tried to do, but then I realized what I'm going to tell you kind of too late. But because I was taught incorrectly that it's like about compound interest, right? Like that the idea is if you can make 7% on your money, or this percent or that percent, or historically, what you make like 11% or something in the Dow or the S&P. And oh my goodness, the magic of compound interest, right? But of course, mathematically speaking, compound interest is just an actual mathematical thing you can calculate, and obviously, I'm not denying that. But I mentioned the stock market and how to actually harness it, because it's just another illustration of the exact same thing I'm talking about with luck, which I get a little bit jumping around, but whatever. I have to do a little bit of stream of consciousness with these webinars, and when something comes up, I have to kind of get it on film, so to speak. What really goes on with investing is, and in particular things like the stock market, are where you'll see this versus like I have a lot of my money in municipal bonds where this isn't going to really happen in the same way, which is also very valid, and I have it in like insurance vehicles and so forth. That's valid for my situation. But in terms of making money with the stock market, I was taught in terms of compound interest, and it wasn't happening. And so what's really the case is there are these luck spikes that you just have to be in the game to take advantage of, right? Like right around when Trump got elected, then there was this just massive spike in the stock market for various reasons. And that in and of itself doesn't mean that Trump was great. In terms of for president, I'm a Trump fan, right? It doesn't, to be a fan of someone, it's a fan of where their talent is or what they're good at. Of course, with Trump specifically, we have to have disclaimers, right? With everyone else, they can be good at what they're good at, and they don't have to be perfect in every way in the world. But with Trump, of course, he's supposed to be perfect in every way. And we have to disclaim that we aren't saying that he's perfect in every way when we're saying that we think he's great specifically as president. I can just say that like just calmly and strongly now, because the great news is that, not the great news, but if people want to disagree with me, then they're in the position of saying, no, the epitome of brilliance and the leftist pinnacle of brilliance and morality they've shown is Biden, right? So if that's their argument for, yeah, we're so awesome, you're pathetic, you like Trump, you're deplorable, you're an idiot. Instead, the pinnacle of brilliance and morality, right? Because it's very moral with the left, with everything, is Biden and Kamala Harris. So that's I think that speaks for itself beautifully these days. It's amazing, right? Just an extraordinary thing to be absolutely hysterical about how awesome you are on the left, and then and say, you see, Biden, he's not immoral, like Trump, not corrupt. Okay. All right. Continuing on here. So they're saying that with politicians, physicians, financial advisors, and so forth, the way people judge them is outcome bias. Oh, and that's also what made me think of Bush, is because it's easy to forget the whole arc of how things happened, and then people were really behind him initially with the Iraq War, and then things continued on from there. And then with the outcome of it ended up where it's all confusing, right? Because you have these bizarre narratives that are half false. But there was the idea that there were not weapons of mass destruction because a whole bunch of shiny new nukes weren't found, even though there was plenty of weapons of mass destruction actually found, and also in the past actually used, and plus actually moved over to Iran, all three of those things. But there was, anyway, the idea came about that there was no weapons of mass destruction, and that it was basically a waste with Iraq. I'm not really, it's whether or not it was a waste or not, but then one way or the other, Bush ended up with he went from in the 90s in approval ratings soon after the bullhorn moment to the 20s with the exact same decision, right? And then people were like, remember, people were horrified and they're all criticizing him about doing nothing, and then they cheered him to do something, and then the outcome, where it seemed like Iraq and Afghanistan, another fascinating thing is Obama beat the heck, rhetorically speaking, with rhetoric, out of Bush for taking his eye off the ball. That's an exact quote, and not focusing on Afghanistan where the real opportunity lay. And now we see with Afghanistan how that all turned out. But the outcome bias of that you see with Bush and how he went down to 24% approval rating based on the outcome didn't seem great with Iraq. Okay, when the outcomes are bad, I don't sorry, in case there sparks any kind of emotions with the political stuff, sorry about that. Let's get back here, focused here. When the outcomes are bad, the clients often blame their agents for not seeing the handwriting on the wall, forgetting that it was written in invisible ink and that became legible only afterwards. Actions that seemed prudent in foresight can look irresponsibly negligent in hindsight, right? That's why I gave the illustration with the Iraq War. Just helps us kind of picture it and understand what I'm reading here. Based on an actual legal case, students in California were asked whether this, so this is really fascinating. Okay, so there's like a little psychological study here that's really interesting to hear. Based on an actual legal case, students in California were asked whether the city of Duluth, Minnesota should have paid the considerable cost of hiring a full-time bridge monitor to protect against the risk that debris might get caught and block the free flow of water. One group was shown only the evidence available at the time of the city's decisions. 24% of these people felt that the city of Duluth should have taken on the expense of hiring a flood monitor. The second group was informed that debris had blocked the river, causing major flood damage. 56% of these people said the city should have hired the monitor, although they had been explicitly instructed not to let hindsight distort their judgment. Okay, so let's review that. So you have two groups of test subjects, college students, basically, they're always the ones in these psychological tests. And they're given the information that the city council had ahead of time. And then they're asked what the city council should have decided. Should they pay a cost to have a full-time flood monitor or not? And one of the groups was told that the outcome would be bad, right, if they didn't have the flood monitor. There was going to be a lot of flood damage. And they were told to ignore that ability to look in hindsight. Despite being told to ignore it, 56% of them said the city should hire the flood monitor, whereas the kind of control group said that 24% of those people said that, so 24 versus 56%. Was the difference that the hindsight made in people's kind of collective judgments. The worse the consequence, the greater the hindsight bias. In the case of a catastrophe such as 9/11, I'm reading from the book now. That's also what made me think about 9/11. Yeah, we are especially ready to believe that officials who failed to anticipate it were negligent or blind. On July 10th, 2001, the Central Intelligence Agency obtained information that Al-Qaeda might be planning a major attack against the United States. July, August, September. So it was about 2 months minus a week, whatever, beforehand. George Tenet, director of the CIA, brought the information not to President Bush, but to Condoleezza Rice, the national security advisor. When the facts later emerged, Ben Bradley, the legendary executive editor of the Washington Post, which is, of course, a leftist newspaper, declared, quote, "It seems to me elementary that if you've got the story that's going to dominate history, you might as well go right to the president." But on July 10th, no one knew or could have known that this tidbit of intelligence would turn out to dominate history. But still, this guy criticized that, given that this is going to, what was going to happen in the future, the guy should have known it in advance. Okay. And now this has a lot of practical consequence. And remember, this is holographic. So when this looks like a social policy thing or whatever, this is going to come into play constantly in our lives, in our day-to-day lives, in our business lives, and so forth. Because adherence to standard operating procedures, right? Like, so basically this gets enshrined into law, by the way, with the standards and norms and so forth, right? Like we see this with COVID now, where like you go to Starbucks and the employees all have to wear masks, right? And why is that? Well, probably, right, we're in America, where America, I think, has like, I'm sure I'm exaggerating, has like 100 times more lawyers than like the rest of the world usually, in terms of population density. I think it has 100 times more lawyers than engineers in America. I think that's an actual stat, but maybe I'm wrong. But of course, the enshrined into law is that if you're basically following standard accepted procedure, then that's a great defense against civil litigation, right? So what Starbucks is probably trying to do, or what corporations in general try to do is, or they have to follow like CDC guidance, right, and so forth. If they're doing that, then no matter how ridiculous it is, or even detrimental, then basically life in America revolves around, in a lot of cases, not getting sued. right? When you're, and so, but the standards and norms is kind of the defense. So it kind of shows how, again, standards and norms just feels like the right way to go. So because adherence to standard operating procedures is difficult to second guess, decision makers who expect to have their decisions scrutinized with hindsight are driven to bureaucratic solutions. By the way, I'll see this in business with sales, like sales letters, like that you're writing online. People tend to want to be very safe when writing a sales letter. They tend to want to copy things that have worked in the past and so forth, because they don't want to either be criticized by someone else that they're working with, or kind of criticize themselves, right? Like if they're kind of copying from a famous or a working sales letter, basically people try to copy a lot of type of sales presentations in various forms. And a good amount of that can come down to this sort of having your decisions scrutinized. One thing you can do is try to put people in a position to not be scrutinized in some cases, and another just being aware of this, this bias towards wanting to kind of stay safe and doing what's kind of already worked, already normal. Right? You're going to see this in movies, right? If there's a bunch of people involved with making a movie and deciding to do it, then if it's like, oh, let's do a remake of this thing that worked in the past or a sequel, then that's a lot of what happens, because it protects people, right, from being second guessed as strongly. As malpractice litigation became more common, physicians changed their procedures in multiple ways, ordered more tests, referred more cases to specialists, applied conventional treatments even when they were unlikely to help. These actions protected the physicians more than they benefited patients, creating the potential for conflicts of interest. Increased accountability is a mixed blessing, right? Same thing with the, back to Bush, but with his standards with teaching, right? It makes perfect sense on the surface when his whole thing about his attitude towards education is like, we need to hold teachers accountable and so forth. But then the problem is, when you're holding people accountable, then people can't take risks either, right? And they're going to just do things that are standardized as much as possible. And they're going to be scared. They're going to be covering their butt. And you had a similar thing with teachers. What was it called? Standards of learning, right? And stuff around that era versus just a lot like what you see with physicians, where it became about covering their butt based on the pressures on them, instead of doing things that would, in their judgment, help. Then we can wonder how good their judgment is as well, right? But you kind of there's a way that if we sometimes if we reject the easy solution, like the FDA, the accountability, the standards of learning, and look for an out-of-the-box, perhaps, but if the solution was in the box, it might have already been found, right? Like things that where there's a problem, like with teachers. Again, I'm thinking here of some social policy things, but we could, again, I kind of skip around between whether I'm using a business example, a relationship example, or a social policy example. But when the idea is like, oh, schools are failing our kids, and also bad teachers, they're protected by unions, they can't be fired, and then there's attempts at reform, then instead of just this idea of let's have another layer of accountability, right? And which happens like constantly, especially with social policy, right? The whole idea of the FDA, which a ton of people I think buy into, the Food and Drug Administration, right? They feel like, oh, well, what would we do without the FDA? Because corporations, right? Like the whole leftist, sorry, not the whole, but a huge leftist pro-government, worshiping government as our savior type of religious or social or political idea, right? Once you spot it, you kind of see it constantly, and you kind of see it's like a religious idea, where like to me the leftism is like a religion, and it's a government worship religion, right? Where it's like look to the government to save us, and it's it always ignores this kind of elephant in the room fallacy of like who watches the watchman, right? Like what makes the FDA less corrupt? And as a matter of fact, the FDA people have less incentives on them than like they're always, whenever you hear people blame corporations, which happens a lot, right, and vilify corporations, then that's where this is heading, right? It's is like we need the government to save us from corporations, because there isn't usually like some other solution, right, that people get, right? If the corporations are bad, then it's always there's no point in pointing that out unless you are saying that the government is we need the goodness of government to save us from the evil of corporations. The problem is there's really more incentive, however bad things can go with corporations or businesses in general, like on the internet, right? When there's not much regulation, there's plenty of bad actors, but you get the government involved, and now you have people with even more perverse incentives watching the people. Like corporations have brand incentive, which is significant, right? And the bigger the corporation, in essence, the more they have like a brand incentive. People think like, oh, big corporations are evil, and they're certainly not like inherently good, of course, or angelic. But and I'm not an apologist for corporations, and of course these days with like the big tech and the censorship, we have this particular animosity, right, and myself included, towards when we think of corporations, right? But again, it's only going to get worse with government getting involved, right? Because government is also, when you look at the root, what it's rooted in, when we look at cause and implications, what's the real root of government is, and this is not opinion, this is logically true, right? Is the threat of violence, or of course actual violence, but mostly it's the threat of violence, right? Or in large part, right? It's the threat of violence. In other words, legislation, like all these things that there should be a law against this, right? A law is a threat of violence, backed up by, of course, actual violence, in various cases. But if we're saying like, oh, the solution to vaccines may be working well or not is to start threatening violence towards people that have that make vaccines kind of proactively, right? Well, is that correct? Who's threatening the violence, right? Just like anyone can threaten violence. Why not just give each individual person the ability to legally shoot anyone from a corporation they want if they give a have an ineffective vaccine or one that harms people? Well, what if that was the case? Again, this is just a random example though of how to think about something by thinking around or thinking of the like looking at the premise that's supposed to be there. So this will be very illustrative, little random, granted, but illustrative. What if we made it legal that if a vaccine turned out to not be like detrimental, then any person could pick up a gun and shoot anyone involved with a corporation that was making that pharmaceutical company? Who would say, oh no, that would be chaos, we wouldn't do that. But what's fascinating is that's the logical equivalent, the practical and logical equivalent to giving that same gun to government, to the FDA, because the FDA are random people. Do you see? They're not. The only way they're not random people is if we assert that they're extra angelic. Do you see? Right? Like, now we could think further and say, well, hold on. If anyone can then legally pick up a gun and shoot them, then the problem is that even if 99% of people don't shoot them, then they're, the one most violent, the kind of the worst person could shoot them. So maybe is a little bit different. But it still remains true that we could alleviate that then by saying, well, what if we picked a group of random people, like 10 random people, and said these people are allowed to shoot or jail the people in the corporation, right? If they are shown to have an ineffective thing. Anyway, I'm getting myself a little bit in circles here. But the one way or another, it remains true that the theory of the government will save us is always depends on the government being made of people that are really extra angelic, because the pressures on or the motivations are perverse on government agencies, and we just saw like a massive amount of death and suffering just directly attributed to the FDA right in front of everybody, and yet it's not being talked about, right? Instead, everything else is being blamed rather than that. And they literally blocked therapeutics, like pills that just directly, kind of cure either COVID in half the cases, 90% of the cases, et cetera. They also drive the cost way up of drugs. Okay. Okay, so that's outcome bias. Now, so let's talk about this is really cool. The halo effect and outcome bias combine to explain the extraordinary appeal of books that seek to draw operational morals from systematic examination of successful businesses. So Built to Last, all right? Jim Collins and Jerry I. Porras' Built to Last. One of the best known examples of this is that book. The book contains a thorough analysis of 18 pairs of competing companies in which one was more successful than the other. The data for these comparisons are ratings of various aspects of corporate culture, strategy, and management practices. Quote, we believe every CEO, this is what the authors claim, the authors proclaim, we believe every CEO, manager, and entrepreneur in the world should read this book. You can build a visionary company, all right? And I've talked about this type of way of operating or writing books where you like look at a bunch of successes or even maybe success and failures, in this case, side by side. And then you come up with supposedly this is going to show people how to be successful, like what to avoid, what to do. And it on the surface, it makes such sense. Anyway, so I'll continue to read. The basic message of Built to Last and other similar books is that good managerial practices can be identified and that good practices will be rewarded by good results. Both messages are overstated. The comparison of firms that have been more or less successful is to a significant extent a comparison between firms that have been more or less lucky. Knowing the importance of luck, which I haven't necessarily covered thoroughly in our series, but in this book he talks about it. And I'll get to it a bit in this webinar. Knowing the importance of luck, you should be particularly suspicious when highly consistent patterns emerge from a comparison of successful and less successful firms. In the presence of randomness, regular patterns can only be mirages. I need to skip to like a punchline here so you really get like what I'm saying here. On average, the gap in corporate profitability and stock returns between the outstanding firms and the less successful firms studied and Built to Last shrank to almost nothing in the period following the study. So the 18 corporations in 18 pairs of competing corporations in Walmart and some competing corporation, right, or whatever, in their niche, and then 18 of those. And then you'd think this would be this amazing analysis, and you read this book and you're like, yeah, now I know how to make a business that works. And I've seen this for so many years. People will basically do the equivalent, like actually read these books or kind of glean it from Gary Vee or whoever, right? The kind of secondhand, whatever. Just this gets repeated, it gets put on Instagram memes and all this stuff. right? Quotes from these successful people and so forth. And they think that that's giving them good information about how to make a business work. And in actuality, these supposedly bad companies that were supposedly following these bad practices with weak SEOs, they caught right up to the supposedly great companies using these supposedly great methods. As a matter of fact, a study of Fortune's most admired companies finds that over a 20-year period, the firms with the worst ratings went on to earn much higher stock returns than the most admired firms. So what's the phenomenon here? Well, success, and this is not the only formula for success I'm going to give you, okay? But we need to acknowledge and understand this, and this needs to be incorporated in our understanding of success. And I'll talk about why this is so important in a moment. Success is a mixture of talent and luck, and extraordinary success is basically a mixture of that same amount of talent and a lot of luck. Or maybe a little bit more talent and a lot of luck, right? Like if you look at the ball players who did extremely well in certain years, if you look at if you pick the ball player that did the best in home runs or whatever in like baseball, then you would expect him to have a bit more talent than some of the other good players, like a bit more talent than a bit more talent. Like the ones who generally do well in the top 10%, you'd expect them to have more talent than average. The ones in the top 1%, you'd expect them to have more talent than the ones in just the top 10%. However, they also probably had a bunch more luck, and proportionally they probably had, it was more about luck than the increase in talent. So there's a bit of an increase in talent, but there's a big increase in luck for them to have such a good year. And when it comes to companies and stocks and so forth, I don't, in my life, it should take a lot of focus to kind of get this probably right and get the information right. But yeah, like according to this, you can just invest in like the firms that are supposed to be doing, not maybe doing the worst, but whatever. Like you, how would it work exactly? The firms with the worst ratings in the most admired companies went on to earn much, not just higher, but much higher stock returns than the most admired firms. Because the most admired firms are going to be the ones that recently had the most luck. Luck evens out. Now, if you're lucky one year, it does not mean that you're going to get unlucky the next year. What happens? What happens in life is regression to the mean, which just means that the average is the average. So on any given year, you should expect to have an average amount of luck, regardless of the previous year, right? So you don't expect worse luck because you had good luck the previous year. You just expect average luck every year. But what that means is if your luck's a 9 out of 10 one year, then the next year you expect your luck to be what? A 5 out of 10, as always, right? And so that means you're going to do worse, right? And in terms of stocks, where the price is kind of based on things like growth and how well you do compared to the previous year, right? Then that's going to really affect the price. So whether it is business or whether it's dating, or whether it's you're in a marriage, right? So let's say you're in a marriage and you've had a really good week. A lot of sex, a lot of attention with each other, or whatever, okay? Just generally nice to each other. Then, and this type of thing is going to come up a lot in your life, and it's going to have a significant impact if you handle it well or if you don't handle it well. What should you expect the next week? Right? Now, how will people talk? People will talk after that good week. If they're talking to a friend, they'll be like, I have this great marriage, we have sex X number of times per week, or, you know, my husband did this for me, he did that for me, he spends this amount of money on me, whatever, right? We go, and we often, that's when we'll often hear from friends how things are going, right? Is when their luck hits like a 9 out of 10. But they don't see it as their luck hit that, because to people's minds, there's a vastly disproportionate, whatever is psychologically near is vastly disproportionate in terms of reality. What's near and in front of us is like almost all there is to our mind. It's all there ever has been, and so forth. So what you should expect the next week is that relative to the base rate of your particular marriage should be a what? Basically a 5 out of 10. But then what will people conclude? Oh, something's wrong. You don't like me as much, right? Et cetera, et cetera. You know. Now, one of the things people can also get is if you do hit a 9 out of 10, it's useful to kind of see why. And now there's another way to illustrate a general principle of our mind attributing causes. What will our mind attribute to be during that 9 out of 10 week? Our mind will attribute what as the cause? What will be disproportionate? Basically, agency is disproportionate. Agency in terms of people's agency is the idea of like a person having an impact through their character, their skill, their effort, right? Whatever, like kind of free will, like agency, like you're an agent, you can do stuff, right? So it's like what people kind of decided and chose to do, and their talent, their inherent, between their inherent awesomeness and their effort, right? They did stuff. Our mind will disproportionately attribute that to being the reason why things are at a 9 out of 10. And also remember, if things are at a 9 out of 10 in a particular week in a marriage or in a business, particular month in a business or whatever, then, so first of all, disproportionate in terms of agency, probably disproportionate in terms of your agency, right? And inaccuracy like that will just lead to various bad implications, planning, right, and so forth. In terms, so attributing it to your own awesomeness or to your partner's awesomeness can cause you to miss environmental factors that could actually be either duplicated to some degree and or anticipated and or planned for, like not, maybe not, in some cases, maybe not easily duplicated. Maybe you're just literally on vacation, right? Or maybe there was like an enforced vacation, like there was a blizzard or something like that. You could also, by realizing the environmental factors, which are to a good degree real, but also fluctuate based on luck and they're not totally in your control. But you can also anticipate when things will be worse, when you're going to have a 2 out of 10 week. And first of all, be kind of ready for it. You know how our mind bases our like our happiness and all kinds of judgments and stuff on norms and standards. And so we can on purpose say, oh, okay, because of these factors, the norm for this week is actually going to be kind of a 2 out of 10 in our relationship in a certain sense, right? If you follow what I'm saying. And then that can actually kind of prepare you for it psychologically, and then you can even prepare for it if there's other ways. With just thinking of like the story, the biblical story of Joseph and the Pharaoh and the famine that came after, there was some good years, right? And what can happen during good years of crops, right? In the case of ancient Egypt and so forth. They can increase their exports, right? You can do all sorts of things. You can basically increase your monthly expenses of, in this case, like grain, right? You can have many more people move to your land because there's a big harvest for a few years. There's more mouths to feed. So again, people can increase their export commitments, whatever. But then Joseph foresaw a famine, and the Pharaoh happened to listen to him, and then they stored a bunch of grain, and that worked out really well for them. In life, you don't have to foresee a famine, but what you can foresee is that luck fluctuates. So if luck is normally a 5 out of 5 with your business, then sometimes there'll be a 2 out of 5, sometimes there'll be a 5 out of 10 is what I meant to say with luck. Sometimes there'll be a 2 out of 10, sometimes there'll be a 9 out of 10. Instead of like predicting those things, you are ready for those things. But again, instead, when people over attribute agency to outcomes, then when there's a 9 out of 10, people will ascribe that to the awesomeness of themselves, their partners, their planning, whatever, right? The way that they set goals, right? People will literally think that the fact that they set a goal for a certain amount of money and then hit it was like the primary cause or factor, and they're hitting a goal. That may be like, remember we talked about bottlenecks, and there's just a whole bunch of potential bottlenecks. And once in a while, the bottleneck might be that you don't have a clear goal and that you're not focused around it and have momentum around it and have kind of all these people aligned with that goal. And then you have things in your environment kind of feeding into that goal and keeping you focused on it. If that was the bottleneck, then yeah, great. But that's why we want to think in terms of bottlenecks, because that's not the only bottleneck that's going to be occurring in your business. So if that's the bottleneck, you do want to identify that and have that going for you. But then thinking that you can just ride on the fact that you've broken through that one bottleneck and that's going to carry you, then that's ridiculous, because you have to look for the next bottleneck. And maybe there won't be one, but maybe there will be one, right? And typically in business, there's going to be another one at some point, right? It's going to come up, or there already is one. And at minimum, you probably didn't hit bad luck if you hit your target when you wanted to, right? And sometimes you're going to hit bad luck, and you're going to want to be prepared for that in various ways. One is what you promised other people, right? A simple phrase in your commitments to other people, like barring an unforeseen bad circumstance, I should be able to finish it by this time, right? And also get that time correct, right? Get that time correct by looking at base rates of how long it took you in the past. Base rates, not big fish story, you know, when you got lucky. And then factor in a little bit of bad luck. Like what if, you know, you at least want to commit based on what? Luck being at or above a 3 or a 4, as opposed to being at or above a, you know, 6 or a 7, right? And then like you don't have to have your promises to like a client or a business partner be based on like worst case scenario, because then you might just kind of come across a little bit slow and incompetent. And it might also just kind of, in various ways, it's kind of planning for the wrong thing, right? I don't plan for the worst case all the time, but you plan to not be taken out by the worst case, right? And so you don't make an absolute promise. You kind of just put an extra phrase that's clear that they don't forget that you said, right? That barring a particularly bad luck, unforeseen circumstance, and you can stop and say, which really could happen, right? That kind of thing can happen. If it happens, I'll try to let you know as soon as possible. But you might even, depending on the situation, you might even say, I've always finished it in such and such an amount of time, you know, but I know in life sometimes there's bad luck or things we don't see, like, you know, recently with COVID, right? We didn't see this coming, right? You say, like, for example, COVID came about 2 years ago, we wouldn't have seen it coming, right? If somehow something like that happens on a, you know, smaller scale, then I'll let you know. You know, COVID kind of lets us kind of, in a kind of a simple, nice way, kind of let people, you know, point out that sometimes we don't see things coming that are going to, you know, cause a significant hiccup in things. But outside of that, yeah, I should have it ready by this time, or, you know, I should be able to do this. And just in your own financial planning, you know, how did I save such a good proportion of my money, or whatever proportion, or just save in a way that I hit my goal of being financially free, is instead of, I really did attribute luck all the way through to a significant portion, is a significant factor in my income. Including, you know, like in this particular life, we live one life. And so bad, like something that kind of causes particularly bad luck that'll kind of mess us up in business for a while, because we kind of only get one shot, at least in this life. I can't really comment on what'll happen after we die, right? In terms of whether there's additional lives or whatever else happens at some other place. But we get one shot in this one shot of life. And so that means in some cases we do have to plan for kind of the worst case. It's a bit of a cost benefit thing, like how much of a worst case you plan for, and what the cost of planning for an increasingly unlikely type of thing, right? If there's a very high cost to planning for something that's extremely unlikely to happen, then it may well not be worth it. and you try to figure that out accurately. As I continue with these videos, we'll talk more about how to think accurately. But it should really fascinate us that this Good to Great, sorry, it's not Good to Great, I miswrote that. There was a book called Good to Great. The actual book that's referenced in this story is called Built to Last. So that was a little mistake there. Okay, fascinating, right? Again, the kind of pull quote is, on average, the gap in corporate profitability and stock returns between the outstanding firms and the less successful firms studied and Built to Last shrank to almost nothing in the period following the study. So the book, apologies to the authors, whatever, the book, according to this book, is pretty much completely worthless. And if you're getting business advice from book like that, and pretty much all business books are that type of thing, it's either one person trying to look back and give causes for why they were successful, or it's this interview type thing, right? Or analysis of multiple companies, type thing. And that it's constantly some version on that. Variation on that. Same thing with Think and Grow Rich. Now, what we can do is we can look at those books and we can probably glean something useful, but not from the conclusions. Once you get in the habit for yourself, like I talked about in the second webinar in this definitive series, once it gets more and more internalized how and why to separate out conclusions, right? When I talk about quarantining conclusions, and then you can extract kind of what might be called raw data or whatever. But again, to picture Sherlock Holmes going about solving a case versus there's kind of like the silly detective, right? Like Lestrade, kind of the arrogant type of detective. Then there's kind of the incompetent at being a detective, but who's trying, like Watson. And you want to kind of be like neither of those. Like Watson's not focused enough. His method is not up to snuff when it comes to competence, right? Like in Sherlock Holmes, they put it in a way that I don't really like, which is like, oh, you see but you don't observe, or you see but you don't see, or whatever. That points to a distinction, which is useful, but then we want to figure out what that distinction really is. You can't just like look harder, so to speak, right? You need to, in a sense, yes, but you need to have a way that you're not missing potentially important pieces of raw data. You can write them down, whatever. The biggest thing is respecting anomalies, respecting potentially helpful experiences, doing things that'll help you not miss little points, like taking notes on if you're interviewing suspects, right? Taking notes on what they say and reviewing them, and just kind of having a way to kind of look at them as a whole without the mind kind of deleting ones that don't fit into our picture, right? Like realizing our mind's gonna delete things that don't fit into its existing framework, and then having a way to somehow overcome that by revisiting the raw data as you accumulate more framework is kind of a way to do it. Even when people rewatch these webinars, right? When you watch it a second time, you'll have more of a framework of what we talked about. Or if you watch it after watching several other webinars, right? And then you go back and you watch some, you have more of a framework, and then you get more from the same data, you see? So revisiting raw data can be important. I would do this actually when I played Magic: The Gathering, the card game, the strategy card game professionally. I would have things that kind of forced me to look at all the cards in a particular format or set that would, like there might be 1,000 cards that were available to be used to build a deck to take into a tournament, and a deck might be 60 cards and you can repeat cards. So there might be 15, 20, 25 unique cards in a deck, and then some of them are repeated, and you have to figure out how many copies you want, up to 4 or whatever. In a total of 60 cards out of a pool of maybe 1,000. And so when people would look the cards over, you have to look at, if you're looking over 1,000 cards, you have to be doing it with a framework that causes you to kind of notice certain cards and not others, right? Because you kind of can't notice every card equally, in the sense you might notice but remember and kind of assimilate. But I would kind of go back over it and over it as I accumulated a framework, whereas other people would kind of get more narrow in their thinking. They would kind of get into a theme that they would use to see, and they wouldn't really break outside that theme. They would that theme would make them feel comfortable and secure, and that type of way of operating is how minds work, and it's overwhelmingly common. But as we develop an understanding of the constraints of that, and then ways to I don't want to use, I was going to use, that's where the word overcome would kind of flow, but we have to embrace the fact that our brain, like we talked about briefly about system 1 and system 2, which is Kahneman's model. It's very useful, right? System 1 is more of like the automatic mind that operates in a certain way, and system 2 is when you stop and using kind of effort, you think things through. But that's a limited resource that kind of gets depleted over time and needs to kind of recharge. So it's limited resource means we have to use it strategically, which means we can't just flippantly say, oh, I'm going to use system 2, or I'm going to focus all the time, or I'm going to think. You got to think, right? You got to not make assumptions. I'm saying that in quotes, I'm caricaturing that. Right, that's ignoring limited resources to say that you need to question every assumption. Don't make assumptions, don't listen to authority, think outside the box. All of these things assume, without realizing it, that we have an unlimited ability to like pay system 2 type of attention and think things through with intention and effort, attention and effort, and intention, attention, effort. It's actually a limited resource. Excuse me. So, and it's kind of our, in one way of thinking about it, our most fundamental resource. I'm saying something pretty profound here, right? Like our system 2, our ability to use like effort, attention, and the intention kind of combined and kind of do the math, right? Remember this slide here? And really just reading the book, I'm not going to kind of keep doing our book report, because I want the webinars to be mostly with me, not just reading someone else's stuff. But remember how I showed this last webinar and how our mind our system 1 can come up with the average of these lines very easily, and you can draw a pretty great approximation of the average amount of these lines very easily, right? It's easy for our mind to do, system 1. To the total length of all these lines, we need to use system 2 and kind of intentionally do stuff that adds them up accurately. That's an example of system 2. That's intention, attention, effort. And the more we do that in a particular short period of time, the more that's depleted, and the more that won't be there for something else. The more blind we'll be to stuff in our environment, the less we'll be able to resist temptation in the short term, and so on and so forth. So it's in one way of thinking about it, our most profound, our most kind of fundamental resource that we need to strategically use to have the most impact. And this is where this idea of the Othello, the foundationalism, foundational frames, outer frames, getting outer frames right, using intention, attention, system 2, adding up properly, to figure out the heuristics, the workings of our mind that are constant, the way that we talk about on this webinar, about causes. And I know I meandered around a bit, but at least the theme of this webinar with cause and implications, and how our mind fabricates causes, right? This whole idea of this built to last. It looks so right that our mind, that they should look at these companies side by side and come up with these differences and ascribe those to be the causes. And again, it's going to be mostly agency, right? We always want a story where when we watch a movie, right, we want it to be the agency of the hero. Again, an agency means like the free will, the intentionality, the awesomeness, right? All of that combined. Of the hero, we want to feel like that's what wins the day, not just a bunch of blind luck that happens. You just bumble around and things just kind of work out for them. That's not as a good a story, right? And that's true. It isn't as good as a story. Like if you're writing a story, you want, the agency to be there. You don't just want like Deus Ex Machina because the writer said so, and all of a sudden vibranium can do anything you want it to do, right? And like the Marvel movies, that kind of takes away, right, from the story. So our minds like this idea of agency, and the stories that our mind creates about why a company works, why your business is going to work, and so forth, is going to be overcompensating or over stressing agency by far. That's the stories that our mind likes to create. So if we use our resource of intentionality and doing the math and so forth, thinking things to do properly, to understand, identify how our system one mind, our automatic mind, comes up with these causal stories that are skewed. And we want to see how these stories, like just kind of the nature of how our mind comes up with these causal stories, and then implication. And a lot of our mind's implication is extrapolation by our system one, our kind of automatic mind, is constantly extrapolating, right? So the cause is our agency, right? Like not really much more agency, much less luck in the story that our mind makes. And then that's extrapolated. Okay, so when you get lucky but you don't realize it, you ascribe it to your own agency. Then now you judge yourself to be more awesome than you are. Because again, the result was a lot of luck combined with a bit of agency. Instead, your mind makes a story where it's a whole ton of agency with a teeny bit of luck or no luck. Then your mind extrapolates as its way of figuring out the implications in the future based on that, right? So, and basically the way the mind extrapolates for how the future is going to be is really simple. It's, well, how is the present? And that's how the future is going to be, right? So like when you're thinking about getting up out of bed and you may not feel like getting up, then how do you feel like you're going to feel after you get up? Your mind extrapolates from how you feel exactly right now, which is like staying in bed. But what actually happens when you get up is you tend to quickly be fine with being up. I'm not telling you should get out of bed prematurely. I'm just illustrating how our mind extrapolates, right? When someone says, I don't like something, it means right now they don't like it. But the mind extrapolates, so you'll feel the exact same way in the future. Same thing with if you do like something. When you just drank coffee or whatever, or things are going well and you feel high energy, you commit to all kinds of stuff because you feel like when that time comes around to fulfill your commitment, you'll feel just the same as you feel now, high energy, confident, whatever. Whoops, that might not be the case, right? So when we realize that, so cause by our automatic mind is agency based, right? Agency overascribes the halo effect, or the opposite of the halo effect. It overascribes, right? Like that a person, because they're good or they're bad, that's why they do stuff, right? That's why they did this, that's why they did that. If someone's good or awesome, then they're kind of awesome morally, they're awesome this way, that way, whatever. Opposite, right? How various people think about, let's say, Trump, or whoever, right? Everything's bad, right? Because it's associated with that person. And then for future stuff, for implications, your mind basically substitutes how things are going to be in the future with well, how are they now? And then with business, it might be now plus growth, right? Has to be even better. Next year is going to be even better. Next year is going to be even better. You say, well, David, isn't it important to have this idea that next year is going to be better? Well, always what's important is accuracy, right? Because that's always going to lead to better planning. What's going to turn out to be true, and as I continue with this series and what's coming up soon, is I'm going to be talking about thinking accurately, right? Remember I said I was going to talk about goals and the mind and so forth, and foundationalism and such. And then that's going to transition us into accurate thinking. Right here, we're seeing how our mind substitutes for accurate thinking its heuristics. It's kind of easier, simpler rules for how it comes up with conclusions. because what we expect our minds to do, or what our minds expect our minds to do, or whatever, is just too difficult. Predicting the future, figuring out the complex causes for things, right? So many factors way outside of what our mind, kind of has it readily available. So instead it oversimplifies. And so it asks simpler questions, and answers simpler questions, right? Like instead of the complex question of what's going to happen in the future, our mind just says, well, how are things now? Instead of the complex question of all the different factors that combine to create a certain result or lead to a certain result, we just say, well, it was all about agency of the particular main actors. And so then we can start to see how that keeps on playing out in terms of actual implications. So if agency is so important, if my awesomeness is so important, then I need to believe that I'm awesome, and that creates this kind of vicious cycle. In order to, and if I need to believe, if what I believe about the future is right, if I need to believe that I'm going to succeed in order to succeed, and then if my success is based on believing I'm awesome, right? Like if I need to be awesome, if I need to believe that I'm awesome to believe I'm going to succeed, then now I got it right? So I'm looking at kind of the implications of how things go wrong. People get caught in this vicious cycle, right? Like we need my future success of my business, let's say, is or my relationship, whatever, or my dating endeavors is going to be based on how awesome I am. And I need to, and not just how awesome I am, but then I need to believe I'm awesome in order to believe in the future, right? And then so our mind creates a story of how our awesomeness caused our success, and so forth. So what if we think that luck plays a significant factor? Well, you see, luck is also environmental circumstances. So if someone's broke or not is not a matter of their agency, it's a matter of their circumstances. We could look at that like a luck in the sense of it's an environmental circumstance. Of course, it's not luck in another way. Like luck is always relative to our own ignorance, if that makes sense. Right? Like luck doesn't cause things. Circumstance, environmental vectors, right? I'm using cause in kind of a simplistic way, which in a fine, normal, simplistic way. I'll later kind of parse out cause, reasons, and so forth in the future. But it's not that parsing is not relevant for now. So with the disclaimer that I'm using cause in kind of a simple way. Various multiple factors in the environment, including someone's own mind and character, right? But those are just environmental as well, in a certain way of looking at it, right? But then there's a whole bunch of various circumstances, market factors, again, like whether someone's broke or not, all kinds of things. They combine to create a certain result. Luck doesn't exist in the sense of an actual causal factor or vector. Luck is chance, and luck are just an expression of our own ignorance of those factors. You see, so a proper realization of the limits of our knowledge is that so a whole bunch of factors go into a success. If we recognize that, then we have a much better ability. We're not blocking our ability to go and spot those factors, and that's what I was able to do to a large degree. I'm not trying to paint myself as perfect at all, but I was generally aware. I've been aware of this for years, okay, decades, to some degree. I mean, obviously my awareness of it has kind of grown over time. But I've known what I'm saying for a while to a certain degree, and I've used it on purpose. And so when things go well, I then try to look for the various environmental factors that were luck relative to my ignorance previously, right? I didn't know they were all going to happen, or I wasn't aware of even some of the potential factors that could matter. But as I look for them, so if there was a success, instead of just attributing it to my own awesomeness, as awesome as I might be, right? But then I also want to try to look at the factors that went into both my own awesomeness and the other circumstances that might be outside of my own awesomeness, and figure those all out, right? And I might not spot them all or whatever. And remember, our mind is going to want to over focus on agency, like the various main actors and what they did on purpose, or because they were talented. And then we can utilize those factors more, and like it'll be less luck and more that we're aware of those factors. And then we'll also be able to plan in the sense of, oh, okay, a number of these factors are really going to be outside of my control, or just outside of my ability to know how they're going to be when it comes to a particular sales letter or promotion or business endeavor, or how a product's going to turn out or whatever, right? Or a whole business. Or same thing in relationships and so forth, right? You have a 9 out of 10 week in a relationship. You can identify various factors. Some of those can be duplicated more constantly. Some of those can be planned for and invested in to have at least show up more often, like a vacation or whatever the heck. And then others can just be like, like there's monthly cycles where people are going to be, of course, we think more of women with monthly cycles, but it might apply to men as well to some degree. There can be daily cycles for men and women, monthly cycles where people are more and less interested in sex, other things related to sex, whatever, and or other relationship types of things. They might be more or less interested at different times, and being aware of that can just lead to a little bit better planning. Right, and just more accuracy tends to just be better all around. You don't overcompensate or over extrapolate or under extrapolate or whatever, right? It's just I find it very beneficial to just be aware of the potential for those things. It's not like I create a conclusion or a box where, oh, it has to be this way or it's going to be this way exactly. But it leads to better questions, better potential, factors that you can take into account, right, and so forth. And so just with relationships, business, whatever in life, the accumulative impact of having this attitude towards luck, which again isn't luck, but it's real environmental factors, contextual factors that all accumulate, right? And then having a humility towards it that can be to the extent that you should have a humility. One thing I started to say was, as we talk about accurate thinking, what we're going to realize is there's a whole bunch of things we can know that people don't realize they can know if we just think things through. Those things, well, we know them. And so it doesn't matter about being positive or negative thinking or what we believe. We just know. We can depend on those things, whether or not we would rather them be true or not, but we just know them to be correct. Even this idea about luck playing a role. It's not that I'm saying it's good or bad that luck plays a significant role in outcomes. It just is true. And so when we understand and know that, then we can operate based on it because it's just true. And then there's things that are gray areas that we know we're going to know we can't know. We either know that we don't know, and which is the same as we can't know right this second, right? Anything you don't know right now, you can't know right now. Maybe you can know it in the next second if you figure it out real fast. Maybe you can know it in the next week or month or year if you over time figuring it out. But you don't know it now. And so if you have to make a decision now, you have to behave as if you don't know. And then if it's important for you to know and you think that it's worth the bang per buck to figure it out, maybe you can invest in figuring it out. But to the extent that something is a gray area in the sense that you don't know it, you're not about to know it right away, you maybe likely can't know it, that's when belief, you can just pick what you want to believe in that way, and you're not fooling yourself. You understand, I cannot know this, but what I can know is that a certain type of belief is going to serve me better than another type of belief. Like the belief that I potentially can do something or potentially can make something work. Since I don't know, I might as well believe that I can if that's going to serve me. There's times that'll serve you, there's times that it won't. You can just look at the situation. So that's when beliefs come into play. There's all sorts of beliefs that are very useful. And because of in my worldview that we're sharing here, I can take on all kinds of beliefs in gray areas because they're useful. And I have this kind of wonderful flexibility for doing so. I don't have any of the mental block of thinking I'm fooling myself, right? Because again, if I don't know, then I pick the most useful belief. People do this with just one illustration of this might be people will just come up with fantasies that another person just doesn't like them very much because they didn't talk to them recently or they didn't do such and such a thing or whatever. That's often not useful. You can take into account that maybe a person just doesn't like you anymore, right? Like when I'm picking a belief because it's a gray area, then it's not like I picked a belief like it's definitely this way, right? That's because I know that I don't know it's definite. So I'm not going to say it's definite. But I don't just walk around thinking that people just all of a sudden don't like me. You might think, and that really comes into play practically a lot, weirdly enough. It's just kind of a thing that repeats in life a fair amount, is when people just like start thinking that someone else doesn't like them very much anymore, in all kinds of ways. And I just don't have, I don't choose to believe that. Again, it's possible, right? I don't like, it's not right, but I just don't come up with these things. And it just makes people come across insecure, and then people will kind of like proactively do stuff to like pull away from somebody else or show that they don't like them either, like or they don't need them either, or it's not a big deal, whatever it might be. So there's that. Of course, we're about getting slow on time here, but I did that. Let me see here. Let me just talk about people liking you for a second. Also with impressed, it stuck in my mind a little bit. Bryce brought up about who's just a person who's been a participant with my webinars for a while. But he brought up in a recent webinar early on, like in the beginning, I don't know if it was before I was filming it or after, like started recording or not, but about how like he's had difficulty with interviews, job interviews and stuff, and not being hired. And so just a random thing about what causes others to be impressed, I was just musing about. Higher on the slide, of course, with judging other people, we can become a lot less judgmental, which will make us a lot more attractive, or at least prevent a block to us being attractive long-term to other people, right? Being judgmental is not an attractive trait, right? And will wear on relationships, will cause friction over time. And our over-ascribing agency to results, right? Human agency, a person's lack of awesomeness to their results is a major issue with judging, right? It's a major thing that's going to lead to you judging other people extra. It's not that we can eliminate judging altogether, but mitigating our judging down to a small, low level is going to be plenty in terms of practically speaking for relationships, right? It's not practical or reasonable to have no judgments. You might be able to narrow judgments. I've said in the past, just narrow things down to judging what you're going to do. Like the only time you need to judge other people is really judging what you're going to do regarding other people, whether you're going to work with them, get into a relationship with them, marry them, right? Take a relationship to the next level, or reduce it in a level or more in terms of relationship or whatever it might be, whether you're going to depend on them for a certain thing. Then that's judging what you're going to do. It's easy to judge our kids, right? And if we kind of try to remind ourselves to just, again, judge what we're going to do, can be better. But at least we can realize that our mind is going to over exaggerate or overcompensate, whatever the right word is, regarding agency, right? And like that other people should have spotted such and such a thing, should have done this, or why we're upset or why we're angry or frustrated is because of our child not cooperating, right, or whatever. That's over ascribing agency to the reason for our emotions, right, and so forth. Instead, we can look at factors regarding goals and how they're framed in our own mind in terms of why we're angry, right, or frustrated or bored. Blaming, right, similar. This kind of oversimplified, over ascribing agency to blaming people, rather than looking at factors that kind of go into things and complex factors. So what causes others to be impressed, right? Some people kind of get in a circular issue in their life or a downward spiral where they're kind of insecure, and then they'll overcompensate by what kind of comes across as this sort of ill-timed kind of bragging, and then they're trying to like act like they're not while they're doing it, right, and so forth. And it's all this kind of not a great look, right, for people. So what's going to impress other people is going to tend to be timing. A simple illustration that allows me to put a little brag in here about my car, right? I have a Rolls Royce, and I'm a little joking about the brag thing, but if I just kind of walk up to someone and say, hey, I have a Rolls Royce, right? To kind of, if I somehow just kind of put it in their face, or if I find a way to work it into conversation that's a little bit, basically at all, right? Because the fact that you have a Rolls Royce doesn't really need to come into conversation unless you just are obviously looking for an opportunity to install it in there, right? Kind of force it in. Kind of like the joke Dave Barry made about people that went to Harvard. And he said, like, people that went to Harvard, they're always putting in a conversation like, oh, could you pass the salt? You're like, oh, we used to pass the salt like this in Cambridge. It's kind of funny. He's a humor author. So similarly, I could do the same thing with a Rolls Royce, like I did here. But seriously. So, but if it just kind of comes up in life that I'm naturally driving somewhere, or my car is there as it would naturally be, and there it is, it's a Rolls Royce, then it's impressive to people, right? Because a Rolls Royce is generally an impressive thing for the most part. Of course, if someone's not impressed by that, it's perfectly fine, but it tends to be impressive. But then it's timing, right? Like we could say like naturalness, right? Timing. If you have if you have something that is gonna further someone else's goals, right, which is what cause people to like us and be impressed with us, which are slightly different things, but they're also similar, right? There's overlap between liking us and being impressed. But being impressed is kind of like we have just the right talent for their immediate issue that they have, right? They have a problem, or they have a bottleneck that they're kind of aware of, something they want, basically, and we kind of have, and kind of, it's not something that like everyone would have, right? If we kind of have something that's a little bit uncommon, and it meets the moment, right? Then that's going to impress people. And so you're just going to have to wait, right? I mean, it sounds kind of funny, but just like don't be in a rush, to put your impressive thing right in front of their face, and you just have to wait for the timing to be right, and then they'll be impressed. But in order to, the main only thing you do to accelerate that is preparation, right? If you're going to an interview, and of course, just don't do things that are going to get in the way of impressing people. So basically, when you're trying to impress someone, but then feel like you need to do something, the main thing is that the only proactive thing you can do to impress someone is basically preparation. And preparation can be very impressive, right? You do the right type of preparation for an interview, for whatever, all kinds of things. If you're well prepared, but then that's probably going to fit in with what I said about timing, right? You're kind of ready to have the thing that they need, or the kind of an uncommon thing that's going to be useful to them, or be kind of cool. Doing research on a company before you do an interview can obviously be a useful type of preparation that's surprisingly uncommon, right? Especially if it's a little bit in depth. And if you figure out a way that your talent would fit in with a need that they have, and you can express that well, then that's going to be excellent, right? In an interview. And if you're not doing that, then that's a lack, right? That's probably at least kind of, not like a full-on expert at doing job interviews, but generally, if you're talking to someone, and this kind of meeting people happens all the time with potential joint ventures in business or client type of thing, whatever, right? What do we, the whole way that in sales domination, they show, and in Rainmaker, then when those guys show what to do, right? There's going to be this, right, where you're prepared in a certain way to show them how your talent, your thing that you can do, your specialized skill can meet their need, right? So in that way, preparation can be impressive, and then other kind of overlapping with that is timing. And then understanding, what really causes people to like us, right? What I talked about earlier in the webinar, where there's kind of this overlap of matching overlap with kind of specific things that that work for people with their culture, which is culture kind of meets their need for kind of feeling awesome and right, and like they're living up to norms and standards, and and so forth. And then otherwise, the things that kind of align with people's goals. And then you just want to eliminate things that are going to erode a relationship, basically hypocrisy, inconsistency. One thing that's going in your favor with relationships is that familiarity does not breed contempt. Familiarity causes people to like things more, just plain and simple. I could quote experiments if I had them ready for you, but that's been shown. So that's good, right? So and then on top of that, if people like you initially, then there's goals that they have that you kind of overlap with, kind of that feels like you further those, and then familiarity is going to work in your favor. So then just don't be hypocritical and inconsistent, insecurity, right? Neediness. Don't trigger their feeling like you're low status, right? And the simple rule there is you just don't want to reflect qualities to a person that they don't want to believe that they have in themselves. But mostly you can avoid doing these things a little bit by reading and being aware of them, but mostly you just aren't going to do them pretty well if you kind of have yourself reasonably straight. But it's a little bit effortless to keep people liking you when you don't feel like you need to do it on purpose, right? It's the like you don't that it's not, time is not working against you. If time is on your side with people liking you, there's something called propinquity, which goes along with familiarity, which is kind of like being around them a bit, right? So familiarity comes down to having some exposure, repeated exposure with them. That tends to help, right? But just be aware that you don't really need anything past that, and that'll kind of, a lot of hypocrisy, inconsistency, insecurity, neediness, and so forth is like like if you feel like you have to do something and you're in a rush, right? Like neediness is like you're in a rush to have all this, you need a bunch of stuff, right? But if you're not in a rush in life overall, you could be focused, right? You want to get a big result quick, you can be focused, you can invest your resources into something, but you don't need to be in a rush, right? And when you're not in a rush, when you kind of get that paradigm, it kind of, everything, again, all this stuff kind of fits together, right? You're gonna when you're kind of just calm, calmness, and then when you're confident for the right reasons, you're going to convey that you're not low status. You're going to convey, you don't need to be high status. You see, they like you. It's just everything's in your favor. Just being around somebody that already kind of likes you initially, and just being exposed to them in various ways here and there. Again, it's all fine. And so you just don't need to trigger low status things, which is mostly going to revolve around neediness, lack of confidence, whatever. So when you're confident for the right reasons, you're not in a rush, you're not needy, you're not insecure, you have when you're kind of intentional about your frames and your general boxes that are kind of major, right? There's not a whole bunch of things you have to get right in life about outer frames. There's just like a few things. And then that's going to cause you to have this confidence, consistency, because you can have variety within a box, right? You don't have to be like consistency, like Tony Robbins talks about people want both consistency and inconsistency, right? And he talks about how, like, examples. But what people want is consistency regarding outer frames. Kind of have a sense of who somebody is, right? And they're kind of consistent with it. And then variation within that. And of course, being by having the very outer frames consistent, that lets us actually think outside of boxes, that like themes and boxes that people create because they don't have their outer frame solid. They make these kind of smaller boxes and stay within those. So you can be outside of these small boxes, and people like that, right? They like when you're a little bit outside of the box because you're consistent and understandable within kind of these core or outer frames, right? Basic understanding of who you are, all the stuff. When I say outer frames, like just all the stuff we talk about on these webinars, right? It's because basic understanding of who you are, what's right and wrong, and you're generally consistent with those things. And if you're an ally with someone, you stick with your alliance in various ways, right? You try to be a little minimal about what you claim and what you promise, but then when you do, you really try to fulfill that. And when you understand how your mind extrapolates, when you're high energy, you extra watch. You have a red flag. You extra watch what you promise, right, and what you claim, because you're going to tend to overpromise those moments, right? But you have little red flags about that, right? So, but there's certain things you kind of get them straight, and they're straight, and it kind of inherently makes you kind of likable to people that you're already likable to. And then when you realize you only need to be likable to people you're already likable to, right? Because they're just going to be, again, like, as long as you're not really broken, right? If you're kind of particular to the places where your ideas are off, will fix, and then you'll just be fine. And then you'll just have your personality, your quirks and preferences, and that's just going to overlap with some percentage of people in every realm of life: friends, dating, business, all types of various business relationships. And then with those people, it's just simple. It's just easy to maintain relationships. Just be around them a little bit, and just don't be these things, but you automatically won't be these things, right? Again, like I said, you're not in a rush. You have your basic frames, and then you kind of look clever and likable when you can think outside of themes, right? Kind of narrow themes. People like that, and so forth. So good. I just want to cover that too. So again, and I'm bringing this to a close here. In this webinar, I just kind of delved in here and there to places, to kind of the overall idea of how our mind overascribes causes, to simplistic causes, especially that relate to other people, and sometimes major events. What has to be kind of big and obvious in the environment, and people tend to take first prize for that. But of course, major events can do it similarly. Realizing our mind is going to overdo it there and get it kind of wrong. It's not fully wrong, right? It's just kind of wrong and overcompensating or overemphasizing kind of thing. But that can lead to major consequences, like overascribing agency, overascribing and oversimplifying causes. And then our mind, implication is kind of like, well, what comes next, right? There's what caused X, and then, well, what does it mean that X is there, that happened, or this result, good, bad, whatever. Result, what does that mean for the future? Our mind is going to oversimplify that, mostly overascribing agency and our own awesomeness or our own. It's also going to, sometimes we'll feel really down on ourselves because we overascribe our own agency to why things got screwed up or we didn't get a result. And then it's going to overascribe agency and extrapolate and say, well, I'm going to expect the same bad thing in the future. Or we can do it with someone else. We could say, oh, well, this person nailed it. They haven't found the right dating partner for a while, so they're going to keep doing so. Instead of not doing that, not overascribing agency to the cause, and then over-extrapolating how much that same agency is going to mess things up in the future. The more we are aware of this and look for the multiple environmental contextual things that go into something and create a kind of critical mass that causes a certain result, none of them necessarily being the cause in and of themselves, but they kind of, again, add up to where over a certain threshold, then a business succeeds, or a certain amount of money is made, or a client says yes, right, or whatever, then we can not necessarily immediately notice all the causes and give just the right weight to all those causes, but we can steadily increase our understanding. And we can have the less, ironically, the less we do this thing about the past cause is our own agency, and that's going to cause the future as well, the more it frees us up, the more it empowers us, right? You might think it'd be the opposite, like kind of intuitively people feel like, oh, it's empowering to ascribe more cause to our own agency and more of the future stuff to our agency. But the problem is it leads to overconfidence or it leads to depression, neither of which is helpful. It's actually empowering to realize that our understanding of contextual factors can increase, and will inevitably increase as it's not blocked and as we're seeking it. And that will inevitably increase our effective power and inevitably cause things to turn more and more to gold in the future, right? That's empowering, it's accurate, it leads to confidence, leads to us not being into a rush, leads to an upward spiral with our relationships, which leads to us being having more influence over other people, right? The people will naturally want to follow us, not as even followers, but just be more influenced by us. We're always influenced by people, and it's kind of like our mind will put a certain weight on how much influence various people will have over what direction we want to head in, or where we want to invest, where we want to focus, who we want to partner with, right? And the more you're attractive in that way, the better off you're going to be in business, personal, etc. Just an upward spiral kind of in every way. So it's not like we're now the master of causes and implications, but we're hopefully beginning to see how our mind oversimplifies things, why it oversimplifies things, not because it's broken, but because our system one mind, our automatic mind, has to work with what it has. It does what it does. It oversimplifies in order to come up with some answer. That answer kind of gives us raw material when we're looking at things accurately. When they're correct law of implication paradigm, we respect the raw material that the kind of oversimplified conclusions and raw material that our system one mind gives us, but we treat it like raw material rather than final conclusions. We see that it came from a flawed source doing its best, right? Our automatic mind is a flawed, limited source doing its best, but it's really just the right thing for us to have as part of the whole situation. But it shouldn't rule the day. We don't want to religiously kind of worship our intuition and our system one mind. Right? That's where a lot of people end up. Typically, that's normal, right? It's even taught as a spiritual awakening or self-improvement, right? Is this the power of your own intuition and empowering yourself, right? But in this kind of way that's just based on telling you what you want to hear and telling your mind what it wants to hear. And the people believe it themselves, right? They're saying it. But it's all circular in the wrong paradigm. And yeah, and then we can, when we break out of these simplistic causal story that our system one mind creates, when we respect that it creates these stories, we need it as a starting point, but it's not an ending point. It's not profound and wise. It's oversimplified and simple. And that's great once we realize that's all it is that our mind gives us, our automatic mind gives us. And then we can, when we're able, remember, it's a limited resource to use our system to, our attention, our intentionality, our adding things up, logically thinking accurately. We can only do so much of that. So it's great that our automatic mind takes care of so much. But we do want to use our resource, and the more we use our limited resource of attention, intention, and so forth, to start to get causes right, especially ones that are like outer frames that are gonna affect, kind of come up again and again. Then good. Then we'll have those forever, right? And and overall, remember the basic recipe for success. We're measuring progress by seeking, and then we inevitably gain understanding. The very most basic thing that we want to seek understanding about and make progress about, right? The thing that is our greatest bottleneck, and in the absence of knowing anything else, it's useful to guess that it's the great place to reinvest our attention and intentionality and our logical thinking and so forth, is into understanding the nature of seeking understanding, right? We want to turn that on its very self, right? Like we want to seek understanding about seeking understanding. We want to understand how it leads to progress. We want to understand how we can misunderstand understanding, how our automatic mind is going to simplify and twist the idea of understanding, right? That's going to give us, in essence, our greatest returns in a lot of cases, except for the urgencies of day-to-day stuff where they're realistically there's things that are kind of urgent and other people are expecting us to do, or various things that we need to attend to. But the more we can carve out time to seek understanding about seeking understanding, the more we're going to create an acceleration of our acceleration in life. And that's kind of our overall, thing that's always true, that I'm always delving into, I'm always trying to expand on, and so forth. I'm thinking of doing, in 2 weeks, doing a Q&A discussion webinar where I kind of don't control things in the sense that, well, it'll turn out as well as, kind of the whole feedback thing is. I'll obviously be part of how well it turns out, but so will you guys, and individually, each of you. So I'm thinking of doing that in 2 weeks, and then moving forward into how to think accurately. Not that I've said everything I could possibly say about mind, goals, and foundationalism, but I think that a good way to say more about it will be to move on. And then, learning happens in layers. We can always go over things. Like I can kind of get through whatever we want to call it, basics, or at least touch on various important topics that law of implication kind of is about. And then I'll see from there if that'll be the end of the series, or if after I touch on whatever topics I feel like need to be touched on, and then maybe I'll, look at another layer or revisit, the mind and goals in light of, that we've already done one kind of pass through. But either way, I'm thinking of doing a Q&A type of discussion, and people can come on. But it won't be one person on the whole, webinar. It'll be like, if it's useful for a person to come on for a bit, then they'll come on for a bit. Just like any Q&A, right, where we handle multiple topics, and then transition into how to know what's true, and how to know that God exists and such. All right, that's where we're heading. And then, because of course I admittedly haven't been doing a lot of attending to the chat in these recent webinars, and so then we can kind of do that. I might even, depending on how the flow goes, I'll probably just stay in the flow, I guess, realistically, of next webinar, but then also I can look back into some of the talking as well. Good, Elias. Yeah, it's a big shift. The correctness over needing to feel awesome and confident, that was big. And you'll feel very extra awesome and confident from the correctness. It's like it's like diving off the deep end, right? Like whatever, one way or the other, it feels like you don't want to let it go, but you let it go. The kind of the false foundationalism, right, of all sorts. And it turns out that there's real foundations in life that are awesome, truly awesome. And we don't have to believe in the false foundations that our mind, that our kind of automatic mind makes for us. It's not bad. Like there's nothing bad about our automatic mind. We shouldn't, nothing that I'm saying should make you think that I'm saying disrespect it. But it shouldn't be the outer frames. It shouldn't be controlling the outer frames. So you don't drive that in San Francisco. Yeah, I love that. I remember years ago becoming aware of monthly cycle whereby at certain times creativity came more easily. Other times I was more likely to be physically clumsy. Interesting. So it's best to avoid certain activities. This made a huge difference once I realized that I couldn't believe I had noticed earlier. Love that, Julia. That's awesome. Exactly. And it's just illustrative. Examples like this are what we want to do, is extrapolate from them all sorts of other places where this type of thing occurs that we wouldn't have noticed. Not just say, oh, it's about this one thing, but yeah, like that idea that because again, this is an example of where it's a contextual factor that's invisible until you look for it. Because why is it invisible? Because our automatic system one mind, it wants to just ascribe, it oversimplifies. It wants to ascribe it all to one thing, like, oh, I'm clumsy, or oh, I'm adroit, right, or whatever, dexterous, right? And one moment, what you see, like he has this acronym for like what you see is all there is, right? Is very often the rule of the automatic mind. So it's like the moment that you're like being adroit and dexterous, that's who you are, and you ascribe your success and whatever to the fact that you are that way, right? And then another time it's totally forgotten, and you're like, oh, I'm clumsy, and that's why I did this certain thing. And yet, when you are able to go outside of that oversimplification and look for contextual factors, that's when you find things like this monthly cycle that can affect it, and that's just useful. And until you saw that, it was luck relative to your ignorance, right? Like luck is, again, always related to your own ignorance, which is always going to be there, right? We're not going to be omniscient. And so ignorance is not a negative thing. It's a realistic thing, right? Just a realism. Megan Lee says, gray areas when I don't know, I can choose a belief that's most helpful. Wow, strong but flexible. Yeah, this is a terrific concept, and I'll get more into it as I look at, we tried to look at how to think accurately. Love your application of LOI to relationships. It always seems so obvious once you point different parts out. Yeah, relationships are obviously an interest of mine, but also because they're so pervasive in terms of our quality of life, right? In terms of both our just kind of social happiness, and then they relate to money so strongly as well. Not just making money, but also spending money, right? They all kind of come together. So, in essence, if you kind of have your relationship situation right in your life overall, and if you have your outer frames right with relationships, I'm obviously not like super appealing to every person. I don't always say just the right thing, even to people that I'm very close with and like me. It's not about, that I get every detail right, but when you have the outer frames right, then you're in such good shape that my relationship situation is extremely good in my life. Is there a way to deal with the way people react based on results? Part of it is just realizing it, so that like part of understanding the automatic mind is to embrace that other people are going to by default operate that way, right? And so you expect them to judge whether you made the right decision based on how the result was. But just kind of accept that and take that into account in terms of your planning. You could do things that kind of help them a little bit see that it's not only that, if it's relevant. And then, but you can do things like, hey, like I got a little bit unlucky and didn't get the result. I can now I can try to understand more factors that went into that, so I can have more agency in the future because I understand more. But also, I'm not gonna, lament the fact, okay, I lost that client because there was some luck, bad luck. Again, bad luck are real factors that you were ignorant of, right? The answer is not to become omniscient, but of course we can gain understanding by seeking it of more factors. So when I say bad luck, I'm not just waving my hand and saying I could never control that, but you couldn't control it at that, obviously, previously, because you were ignorant of the factors, right? And sometimes you can know certain factors, but you just don't know whether they're going to come up or happen. Elio says, I think the only way I can really say thank you to all and all involved is that I keep seeking understanding and help the next person. Absolutely. Thank you so much, David. It is a blessing. It is not going to appreciate it. Thank you, Elias. And you're really just wonderful with your expressing of your appreciation, and it means a significant amount to me. It definitely encourages me and makes me feel good and provides me with motivation and so forth. So I appreciate that. Always a fun ride. And by the way, motivation is not just a conscious thing, right? Motivation is automatic as well. Like it's easier for me. Like I might not just give up on LOI regardless of how you guys react, but it's easier for my mind to work on the ideas, to focus, to not worry and so forth based on the positive feedback from you guys. Right. Of course, accurate feedback is fine too, and like identifying things and the solution to something I'm doing suboptimally is totally fine too. When I say positive feedback, I don't mean only, but my automatic mind works automatically too, right? And what I think about and focus, like when I'm working on LOI stuff, I have to often I'm musing about things and letting my mind kind of go a little bit, so to speak, and I don't, it's going to go where it goes, and I don't know, like the appreciation and things like this kind of help it in various ways. Thanks for this, Webby. I now have this picture of the LOI luck sliding scale in my mind. Great. More clearly defining luck, as you described it here, is very helpful. Excellent. Yeah, and understanding luck and its role just pays dividends in all sorts of ways. Okay, wonderful, guys. So it would be great if we had a good session in 2 weeks. I'll stick to the 2 weeks unless there's like just some completely unforeseen thing that comes up. But I'll try to post a link kind of early, and we'll do a Q&A, and then we'll go into the other next topic. Very welcome, guys. Love the overviews you do. Oh, you're welcome. Yeah, and just realistically in webinars, for some of the first part, depending, it could be random, but it's going to be a bit of like a free, well, blanking on the word, but free flowing of kind of my talking, and then it can kind of comes together after about an hour or so. But just kind of talking around things and so forth, no matter how many notes I have and how much preparation. I love the concept of luck being real factors you're ignorant of. Yeah, I'm glad that it kind of occurred to me to kind of describe it that way today. Thank you very much. You're very welcome, Marcus and Peter. You're very welcome. We love you. Thank you, Julie. I appreciate the love, and I will, in fact, keep at it for sure. But I appreciate that very much. Take care, all. I look forward to our discussion in 2 weeks, and I look forward to covering the next topic of thinking accurately. But you see how we really had to cover why to think accurately, and how, because thinking accurately really feels kind of useless or confusing. Like, okay, now I'm going to think accurately always. We want to realize that it's a limited resource. Thinking accurately is like a limited thing that we can do. We can't just do it always all the time. We can't just have a paradigm shift where now I always think accurately. Again, it's something you actually like spend, but I'll kind of show you how to spend it well, and kind of when, and so on and so forth. I was just about to start a decision diary. This focus on agency and luck will form a big part of it. Timely, wonderful. That's just awesome. Yeah, it's a really cool thing. I'm glad the agency and luck thing is a really good way that this webinar came together, and then with the causes and so forth. Okay, awesome. You're welcome, and thank you, Megan. I will talk to you guys in 2 weeks.